Shadow fleet is a strategic tool in Russian hands. It is directed by central administration through major energy and shipping companies in Russia. Daily, Russia is transporting the products worth of around thousands of millions of euros. Baltic Sea and North Sea are the main route for Russian seaborne export.
Welcome to Polish Insights on Global Affairs with PISM think tank, a go-to source for expert perspectives on the most pressing developments in world politics and security. I am your host, Marcin Matuszewski, and in today's episode we are turning our attention to the infamous Shadow Fleet, Moscow's tankers which, under the flags of numerous countries, violate international sanctions by transporting Russian oil exports. Joining us today is Elżbieta Kaca, head of the International Sanctions Project at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, PISM.
Hello.
Hi, nice to have you here. For my initial questions, let's assume that there might still be some people unaware of Putin's shadow fleet existence. Bearing this in mind, can you please explain to our listeners what exactly hides behind the shadow fleet name?
Russian shadow fleet, those are tankers of around 700 vessels which operate outside international maritime rules. Those are usually older tankers, on average of 22 years old vessels. They do not have sufficient insurance. They hide their location. They frequently change flags. They conceal their identity. Those tankers are basically used for two reasons. First of all, to not comply with the sanctions. And the second purpose is that they are increasingly used as hybrid threat tool. They, for instance, are crushing the critical infrastructure cables. They are used for intelligence gathering, etc.
So to put it in perspective, can you maybe present some numbers like what amounts of crude oil are transported by the shadow fleet, if we are aware of this, and what kind of money is Russia making thanks to its actions?
Currently, the vast majority of Russian crude oil export, including the petroleum products, are exported through shadow fleet. Around 60% of all Russian export. This means that basically daily Russia is transporting the products worth of around thousands of millions of euros. So this is pretty high number. Russian shadow fleet is the main tool to evade sanctions. We, in our report, which we produced last week, we really see that since invasion, really the Western sanctions, oil embargo and the price cap worsened Russia economic situation and Russia oil export. They forced Russia to sell crude oil on discounts between 2022 and 2025. So Russia earned less that it could have earned. In this period of time, we see that really the conditions of Russian oil export has worsened. For instance, the oil export has fallen by 10%, that oil production has fallen by 5%. This is also the result of the attack of Ukraine on Russian critical energy infrastructure and also
so-called direct sanctions.
Exactly. And we see that sanctions work, but they could work more. They could have harsher impact if not Russian shadow fleet, which is the main tool to evade sanctions. And we see that the coalition, the G7 coalition, mainly EU and UK, with some help with US during Biden mainly presidency, has taken harsh steps to fight shadow fleet, but still it's not enough.
To put it into even better economic perspective, can you maybe say what part of Russian economy is based on money from crude oil? Because it's quite a significant chunk, I'd say.
At the beginning of invasion in 2022, basically 40% of Russian budget were from revenues from selling the hydrocarbon. And we have to remember this is oil and gas. And we have to remember that 80% of this part was gathered by selling crude oil and oil products. And we see that throughout those years, since 2022, the share of Russian hydrocarbon revenues has really fallen from the level of 40% to the level of 25% in 2025. So we really see that, and in real terms, this revenue has fallen by 1/3 in this period of time. So we really see that Russia earns less on selling its crude oil, but at the same time we see that it is quite susceptible to shocks on a global market. And we see that, in February this year, before the war with Iran happened, Russian economy was at its worst conditions since the invasion. We saw that the inflation was high, that the GDP stalled, that, the financial reserves were depleting, and they were in a gloom. And then we see that, since February, since March this year, they are earning extra profits from the fact that there is less oil available because of blockage of Hormuz Strait.
Sanctions circumventing aside, there is also a military / espionage / sabotage side of the shadow fleet vessels actions that you mentioned, especially in the Baltic Sea, I'd say, but not only. Can you please tell our listeners a bit more about it?
You have to remember first that really the shadow fleet is a strategic tool in Russian hands, that it is directed by central administration through major energy and shipping companies in Russia, basically through Sovcomflot. And, they fund a very dense network of intermediaries of companies in third countries like Zia, Hong Kong, China, Turkey, Marshall Island, and other exotic jurisdictions to hide, the connection with Russian state. At the same time, Russia publicly is stating that it is ready to support those vessels, and some vessels are even escorted by Russian Navy. They are secured by armed crew, even by crew officers. And we see that some vessels have been suspected of espionage, of intelligence gathering, looking at ports and looking at critical infrastructure.
There was some high-class espionage equipment on board of some of these old vessels. I think it came to light when Finnish or Swedish authorities boarded one of them.
Yeah, Finnish authorities boarded the tanker called Eagles because it dragged its anchor through 5 cables, some telecommunication cables and 1 energy cable, and the damage was cost around 60 billion of euros to private operators. The officials from Baltic states, they really see some vessels which are just like crossing under critical infrastructure several times, 3 times. So evidently they are doing something. But at the end of the day, it is very difficult to detain such vessels because it is very difficult to prove that it was on purpose. In the case of Eagle East, the vessels was detained. There was the prosecutors put some claims on these vessels, but at the end of the day, the vessels was made free because it was very difficult to prove that it is guilty, that it has done on purpose. And then Finland also said that it has no jurisdiction, because of international maritime law. So, basically there are lots of limits to detain such vessels in various maritime zones. The consensus is that the maritime services of coastal states can detain easily the vessels which are falsely flagged and stateless vessels. And this is an increasing trend because the G7 coalition did lots of diplomatic outreach to flag states to deregister vessels. So we have quite a huge number of such vessels to detain. But then there is also a risk of escalation on behalf of Russia because you never know what will be the feedback of Russians. We have some cases like the detention of Bella 1 and Marinera vessels by Americans and UK services. The vessel was escorted by Russian Navy, but they did nothing. But those are Americans' actions. And if it comes to the EU member states, there is a kind of a risk, what will be the response. So definitely since the beginning of the year, we have dozens, I think around 12 detentions of Russian shadow fleet in European waters, mainly in the Baltic, by Sweden, Belgium, France, in Atlantic Ocean. But we also see that the problem is that the vessels can be detained for several weeks. You can impose a high penalty of several millions of euros. But then, according to international maritime law, you cannot detain such vessels forever in your port. So what might be done is to increase the cost of operation of Russian shadow fleet to somehow make it more expensive to them.
We'll get back to this, but I wanted to linger a little more around the topic of sabotage first, because Poland is on its way to complete some very important investments in the Baltic Sea, the offshore wind farms and such. So within a year or two, it will become even more important to be able to secure them from possible acts of anchor dragging and other hostile acts by the shadow fleet vessels.
Yeah, definitely this is a hot topic currently in Poland, and lots has been done and lot is going to be done in this field. Definitely we have a huge boom of maritime energy infrastructure. This is a shadow fleet, but also the ordinary small vessels, Russian vessels, are really a threat for such infrastructure, and there is a new center in Gdańsk created just to work on monitoring system, Polish national monitoring system, to see and locate quickly such suspicious vessels. Then there is a question, obviously, that how to protect this infrastructure, because there is a risk of escalation. So there is currently a question which institution will protect, either military or Coast Guard, etc. So yes, I think this is the question which will stay with us for coming next 2 years at least.
Last but not least, even if someone has absolutely no regard for all the things we've already listed, another reason that you briefly mentioned for stopping the shadow fleet is the environmental risk these vessels pose. Am I correct?
Yes, definitely. I mean, Russian shadow fleet is basically a threat for all of us. If we see since 2022 in our PISM report on Russian shadow fleet, we have identified around 25 incidents with the involvement of such vessels. Those were groundings, collision, some machinery defaults. So the issue is that those are old ships which should have been scrapped. There is a higher risk of accidents and higher risk in result of oil spillage. So So far, there were no major oil spillage in the waters because the incidents were related to the vessels which were empty. But some journalists have mapped, for instance, some smaller oil spills by some tankers in the Baltic Sea. And you have to remember that, the oil spillage is very harmful for the maritime environment, but also this is a cost because such vessels do not have insurance. So then a cost of one spillage in Baltic Sea is of around 900 million of euros. And then in Southeast Asia, it is even higher of 1.5 billion of euros. So really, there is no point of waiting for such a disaster.
So to sum it up, what are the ways to put a stop to shadow fleet actions?
Well, the only thing you can do it is to minimize risk and to decrease the number of such vessels. And because Baltic Sea and North Sea are the main route for Russian seaborne export, through Baltic Sea, I think around 45% of Russian oil and oil products export goes. So the issue is really to make it harder to pass it. So the answer should be a coordinated answer between Baltic coastal states with the detentions, with the increased controls to make it really harder to pass this and more costly. Then what you can do also is to tighten the environmental standards in Baltic Sea. You can have another convention, maritime convention specifically on Baltic Sea, but also on threats on critical infrastructure. And then also it would be useful if, to push on importers of Russian oil with further sanctions. But here it is position of United States is crucial. So I think it is possible when the oil market slightly stabilizes because of Hormuz threat. So then we can push on importers. And finally, it would be really good to adopt by EU and UK the ban on providing maritime services to Russian oil, because currently, Russia is like bypassing the sanctions on shadow fleet and on the third countries by switching to so-called legal shadow and legal vessels and shadow fleet, because still it is legally possible, to have for instance, Greek or Cypriot operators can deliver their services. If it is not possible, then there is more clarity. And I think those would be enough.
Okay, thank you very much. Our guest today was Elżbieta Kaca, head of International Sanctions Project at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, PISM.